Let's begin by exploring your perspective on the value of music in this particularly dark and challenging era we live in.
Wow, that's a big question. Um, well, my view of music hasn't really changed. Um, the value of music, that's an interesting one because music has obviously been devalued just by streaming devalues it in a way, really. The rise of the playlist has devalued it in terms of, does a younger generation listen to albums anymore? My daughter is 22. She does listen to like her favorite artists' albums, but generally, on the whole, it's a playlist thing with the younger generation. So I'm a bit surprised that the industry has stayed wedded to the album format, to be honest. Not sure how long that will continue for. I think there's less political music going on now. I think people have become a bit afraid of offending people or speaking out, nowadays. Again, with social media, you could be cancelled very quickly nowadays. So I think a lot of people are nervous about that.
What about for yourself? I mean, this album in and of itself has some political and environmental statements, so clearly you see music as a vehicle for that.
Yeah, it's just my own personal view, really, which hasn't changed. It's been my view all along. You know, I've always been a bit of an environmentalist. I've got a degree in geography, which has never been used to me as a career, but um, yeah, it's made me sort of environmentally aware. And certainly, probably the third album, An Ordinary Day in an Unusual Place, if you look at the sleeve and the sleeve notes for that and the artwork in that, is probably the most political thing that I've done. And that's, again, coming from an environmentalist perspective, I think.
All right. Well, back in 2014, you said you were retiring Us3. Tell me about that decision and what spurred you to work under the name again.
Actually, this new album, when I started thinking about this one, it wasn't intended to be an Us3 album. I thought it was going to be um, a side project, really. And I did do a side project with Ed Jones, the sax player, who I've worked with a lot throughout Us3 and has done a lot of the horn arrangements all the way through. I think it must have been about 2003. It was called Edge, which was ED/GE. And that came out of a discussion that we had on the tour bus about how big bands were kind of unfashionable. And we decided to make a sort of big band and beats album, which we did. And we did a cover version of a Gil Evans track on that. We did a cover version of Las Vegas Tango, which I actually prefer our version to the original. Some great solos on that. And I met up with Ed recently, well, not recently now, it was probably about 18 months or 2 years ago, to talk about doing another one. I'd done some trap albums for library music purposes and really liked, I'd had some good response and good usage of that. And I just thought, as I was doing that, it's quite bare musically, really. And I just thought some kind of spacey Gil Evans style horn arrangements would be awesome on top of it. I could hear it before we'd done it, a long time before we'd done it. And so I met up with Ed and we talked about it, but it wasn't really what was in his head about. He wanted to do something a bit more kind of glitchy. And he's got a new project coming out this year, which I haven't heard. So I'm really looking forward to hear what direction he's gone off in. But then I remembered that Mike Gorman, who's a keyboard player, again, that I've used a lot and it's been a mainstay of the Us3 band for over 10 years, had done some orchestral arrangements for Kid Creole. And he'd also done some for China Moses, I think it was. And he also had his own big band at one point, which he never recorded, but I went to see them live. So I talked to Mike about would he be into doing some orchestrations for me in a Gil style? And he was intrigued and up for it. And that's how that came about. Us3 stopped because I got ill. I had a heart attack in April 2014 at home, and then I went into hospital. They put a stent in, and then a couple of days later, while I was recovering, I had a cardiac arrest, and I had to be shocked out of that. And then while I was recovering that night, basically I had another 3 cardiac arrests at different times, and they had to shock me out of each one. They eventually put me in a coma for 48 hours, and when I woke up, it took me, I was in intensive care nearly 4 weeks, actually. It just took me a long time to recover from it. They put another stent in and a defibrillator. So I had a bit of a rough time, really. Even the surgeons and all the doctors and everything said I'd had a particularly rough time. And there was no reason for it, really. At the time, I didn't know why it had happened, because I hadn't eaten red meat since the early 80s. I'd never smoked. I didn't drink too much. I wasn't overweight. I asked my dad, my mum had passed away by then. I asked my dad if there was any history of it in the family, and oddly, he said no. I only found out after he died in 2017 that there is history of it on his side. I never knew his dad, my granddad, on my dad's side. Apparently, he died of a heart attack when I was about 2 or 3 in his early 50s. So it seemed to have skipped a generation, which apparently it does. I don't know why my dad denied that. Maybe he thought that I would blame him or something. I'll never know about that.
And how are you today?
Yeah, it's an ongoing challenge, really. Sort of up and down health-wise. As I said to you earlier, I had another 3 stents put in last October. And I recently was accepted back onto a cardiac rehab scheme again. So this is ongoing. I don't think you can go through that without it changing you fundamentally. And it did change me fundamentally, physically and mentally and emotionally as well. I had 6 months of psychotherapy to deal with it because there was no explanation at the time. I found that very hard to cope with, It was a very graphic confrontation of my own mortality, which most people don't get to experience. I just found that hard dealing with it. I actually sold all my kit, nearly all my kit from my studio, because I used to rent a room only about 15 minutes walk from where I live. And I'd been in there for about 8 years at that point in that studio. But I sold pretty much everything on eBay. And I thought I was done. I thought that was it. I thought I'd finished making music. It was only about 4 or 5 months later that I started getting better, and I was already on a cardiac rehab scheme then, that I thought, I am going to recover. I mean, they told me, you will get back to normal, you will get back to normal. I felt so shit that I didn't believe them. But I did. So basically I bought a new Mac Mini and bought the latest version of Logic and just decided to go completely in the box and kind of set it up in a spare bedroom at home. Watched 1 billion YouTube tutorials. I called a few friends who were also producers and engineers, helped me when I got stuck, and just learned a load of new software. Then I took the plunge and I've got a 100-foot long garden in my house, so I took the plunge and had a studio built at the end of my garden. And that was a game changer, really. So I'd already done a couple of library music albums. There was a guy in the studio next to me in the block where I was called Dave James, who was used to be a big pop producer. He'd produced people like Take That, really big pop albums. And he'd quit all of that and just did library music 100% of the time. And he sort of explained to me how it worked and said to me, your stuff would be really good for this. So I'd done a couple of library music albums in about 2008, 2009, and got them signed, but I'd literally done like 2 or 3. So I decided to, after I got ill and felt better and had the studio built, I decided that's what I'd do, because the advantage of that was, I didn't have to go out and tour it. I didn't have to do any marketing or whatever. It's, for people that don't know, library music is a kind of business to business thing. It's designed for background use in TV, movies, adverts, whatever. So I still got to be creative and scratch that kind of creative itch. And I didn't have any of the nonsense that goes with it in the music business. I don't think I'll ever be fit again enough to tour on the scale that we did before. I couldn't cope with the bus tour again, just not enough sleep. So yeah, I just did library music for 10 years, and I've had over 1,000 library tracks signed now. And I got to work in lots of different genres as well, which the music industry, the real music industry, if you like, is it's almost impossible to do that, really. I could do music in all kinds of different genres and not be scrutinized, which was quite liberating, really. So I did do lots of different things.
And how did that library music journey eventually lead to an instrumental Us3 project?
As I said, I'd done some trap stuff, and I just couldn't get it out of my head that this would sound awesome with some jazz on top. And I'd kind of searched around to see if anyone else had done anything like that, and I couldn't find anything, and I still can't find anything that sounds like this. And it was a bit like when I first started, kind of, the ideas that I had in my head back in the 90s. I thought, why hasn't anyone else done this, really? And I felt very much like that again. And as the more we got into it, the more I thought, this is actually, if I'd started Us3 in 2025, this is what it would sound like. So why not do it as an Us3 album? It's still the fusion of hip hop and jazz. I always said there was lots of different ways to do it, and this is just another different way.
What can you tell me about the creative process that you engaged in that yielded the pieces?
It was very, very influenced by Gil Evans, is the main thing. Mike was absolutely brilliant in terms of the horn arrangements. One thing that Gil Evans was really good at was kind of reinterpreting other melodic ideas. So I gave Mike some kind of basic melodies or whatever that were not, trap stuff isn't particularly musically complicated. So I kept the melodies quite simple and let him arrange around that and develop those. And it just works brilliantly.
From a technological perspective, how would you contrast where we are today compared to when Us3 started out as a basement studio project with 2 guys, a home computer, and a sampler?
Well, yeah, we made the first album on an Atari 1040 computer with an Akai S950 sampler on an AMEC Angela desk, a sort of, analog desk, on recording it onto 2-inch tape. It was really basic. The technology was really basic back then. My iPhone is probably more technologically advanced than the whole of that studio that we made Hand on the Torch in. It's much easier to do things now. I think kids or young producers now just haven't got a clue how difficult it was to do things then. Stretching samples was completely hit or miss, really. You just press the button and waited 5 minutes and then it sounded like garbage and you had to start again. Now it's like instantaneous.
Do you think great art emerged from that struggle, though?
Yeah, absolutely. Restriction is really good for the creative process. I've always said that. I always kind of described producing the rappers. I always brought the rappers into London to record them, and always tried to get them to do something a bit different, whether that was rapping on a jazz break, rapping on a bossa nova rhythm, doing a spoken word thing, or doing something in a different time signature. The way I've described producing rappers in the past was to kind of get inside their head a bit, get comfortable with them, or get them comfortable with me, probably a better description. Because producing someone is like having them in a room, putting four walls around them and getting them to a point where they're completely free so that they can bounce off the walls and do whatever they want, do their own creative thing. But then where it gets really interesting is taking those walls out a bit and putting them in areas where they wouldn't normally go. But once they feel comfortable, then they happily go there. And I think I managed to do that successfully with most of the rappers that I worked with.
And how do you challenge yourself now that you have this entire world of options at your fingertips?
Your imagination is still the biggest thing, I think one thing that I've always been good at is imagining something. What would something sound like? I mean, nothing's new. The thing about music, what's thought of as being new music, is, I think, new combinations of different things, the way you put different things together that might not seemingly fit, but then putting them together in a way that they do fit, which is, again, what I think I've done with this album. I think I'm good at that, good at imagining what something's going to sound like. What I had in my head for this album, it actually sounds exactly like how I thought it would, which is, I'm quite happy about that. It wasn't a cheap thing to do, obviously. So, it may prove to be quite a silly thing to do because I don't know if I'll actually recoup the costs of it. But I felt like it was something that I wanted to do. So I just did it.
Now, the album is, of course, called Soundtrack, and you are telling stories and communicating narrative ideas within it. Talk about how you translate those ideas into purely instrumental music.
Curiously, this album feels more personal to me, maybe because it hasn't got anyone else's voice on it. I never really put words into the rappers' mouths before. I always wanted them to do their own thing. I'd chosen them to work with because I liked their own individual styles. So I may have given them a title or a direction when I was working with them, but absolutely let them do their own thing. And sometimes that's worked brilliantly, and sometimes it hasn't worked as well. But this time I didn't have that. So there's nobody else's story on top of this. So it's all my story, if you like.
What are some of the specific narratives and themes that you are communicating on this record?
What we've done is more about the environmental after effects of industrialization, if you like. The first weekend I was in London, I came down to London when I was fresh out of university. So I was in my early 20s. Walking around London was I come from a small town, so walking around London with millions of people was quite a shock to the system, really. And there was a movie on, and I went into a cinema on Tottenham Court Road, which is right in the middle of London. And it was Koyaanisqatsi, and I watched Koyaanisqatsi. And when I came out of that, I felt like I was in it, kind of. It was absolutely brilliant movie. I urge anyone who hasn't seen it to see that. and I wanted it to be, certainly I wanted the visual representation to of that, the video, to reflect that, which the video was actually directed by Asa, my daughter. So I think she did a great job with that. Resist the Rat Race, that's largely about when I first left school, I worked for an insurance company, and I lived in a place called Selby in North Yorkshire, and I used to commute to Leeds, which was the nearest big city. And I literally sat in an office. I was, 17 or something, because I left school before I had a year out before I went to university. I realised that I'd made a mistake actually as soon as I started working. I should have gone to be a student straight away. But that year was really instructive because I realised how hard work is. In this insurance office, it was like something out of a David Lynch film in a way. It was kind of like 3 rows of about 20 desks, and you just had an in tray and out tray and just sat there all day going through these insurance claims. A little old woman would come along and wheel a sort of tea tray to give you tea and biscuits twice a day, and that was it. It was absolutely mind-numbing, and there were people there who'd been working in that room for like 20 years, and that was very scary for me.
The album has one track called Save Me on it that does have a vocal running through it. Tell me about that tune.
It's actually a sample from a gospel track, which is all cleared, but it was one of those things that when I was listening to it, I've been good at spotting samples in the past, and it just jumped out, and it felt appropriate to my health situation, kind of. So I just thought, I've got to use that.
So what does the future hold for Us3 after this recording?
I've got no idea at the moment, Anil. I have been fooling around with some samples, actually, and got some stuff that, again, sounds different, but an update of more like the old sound, kind of. Whether or not that will come out or not, I've got no idea. I've got to wait and see how this will do, and how much I recoup from it as well. But as I said, Us3 is not going to turn into the touring monster that it was before. I know that for certain.
How do you look back at the last Us3 album, The Third Way from 2013?
I'm really happy with that. That was kind of it was funny that turned out to be the last Us3 album, or very almost was the last Us3 album, because I called it Hand on the Torch Volume 2, because I never really did a proper follow-up to Hand on the Torch, I don't think, in terms of using well-known jazz tracks. The second Us3 album, I kind of used more obscure samples from the Blue Note back catalogue, really. Yeah, I was quite relieved in a way to get away from Blue Note back then after the second album, because I always knew right from the start that it was never going to be a career option, just sampling stuff from the Blue Note back catalogue forever, kind of. Even though that could have gone on for a long time, it probably would have been a bit limiting creatively. But there were other jazz tracks that I wanted to use, and I thought I would do it slightly differently on The Third Way by doing interpolations rather than sampling. Obviously, the band members, I'd had a touring band for a long time by then, and had some access to some fantastic jazz musicians, so that was quite easy to do. And it was fun also using 3 of the vocalists that I'd used on previous Us3 albums: KCB from the second album, Akil, who was on Schizophonic and Say What, and Tucker, who was on Hand on the Torch. So yeah, it was really fun making that.
Well, it wouldn't be an Us3 interview without talking about Cantaloupe, at least for a minute. Manhattan Transfer covered it on their final studio album, The Junction.
They did, yeah. They contacted me when they came to London, actually, and I went to see them and met them, and I've met them a couple of times now, and they've been really, really nice. They played at the Pizza Express in Holborn the first time I met them. They were lovely. They gave me a shout out from the stage because they knew I was there before I'd actually met them. I only met them after the gig, which was a bit embarrassing. Everyone turns around and looks at me. But yeah, they were cool. When I suggested to them that I do a remix of it, the record company were really into that. But then I did I turned it into a beatbox track, actually. I sampled loads of beatbox vocals, and so that everything on it was made by the mouth, which I thought was appropriate to them. But at the time, the label didn't put it out for months, which was a bit baffling for me. Don't know why they did that.
Cantaloupe continues to be performed by jazz and hip hop artists out there, and sometimes even on high profile award shows, and frequently you don't even get credit for it. I'm curious what you make of that situation.
Yeah, it was a Herbie Hancock kind of tribute thing a few years ago now, and there was like an all-star band played it, and Snoop Dogg did the rap. Yeah, I was a bit furious about that nobody credited us three.
Do you feel you've received due credit for your pretty profound influence on hip hop, specifically the jazz intersections with it?
Probably not, no. If you look at Herbie Hancock's profile on Spotify, Cantaloupe Island has something like 3 times as many plays as anything else that he's done. I think Cantaloupe is actually the only example of a hip hop track that sampled a jazz track that made that jazz track become a jazz standard when it wasn't a jazz standard before. So there must be countless cover versions of Cantaloupe Island now. It's one of those things that everybody does. But beforehand, it wasn't. Before we sampled it, I don't think Cantaloupe Island was thought of as a jazz standard, but it is now. And it was the hip hop version that made it.
All right. Well, what I'd like to do is hit you with some albums and projects you've been involved with across your career, and then have you tell me anything that comes to your mind about them. And we're going to go in reverse chronological order.
Okay.
The first one is Us3's 2011 album, Lie, Cheat, and Steal.
I'd kind of got to a point where I wanted to work with a UK vocalist on that album. And to me, there was only one to work with, which was Akala. And he's probably the most political British rapper there ever has been, really. And he was amazing. I'd never met him before, and he was fantastic. I really liked it. Unfortunately, he had other commitments that he couldn't come out and do a whole tour with us when we toured that. He did come out and do about 5 or 6 gigs, but he didn't do a full tour, which I would have liked to have seen how he developed over a tour. But he was great on stage as well. And Obvious was a different character as well. Again, it was interesting putting the combination of 2 people who probably wouldn't have worked together. But yeah, they were fire on stage.
And does that album's theme resonate in 2025?
Absolutely. Lie, cheat, and steal. That's become the norm, isn't it, now? I mean, I was very disillusioned with politicians then, but it's only got worse since then, or certainly has in America. We have a semblance of normality with our government at the moment, but we obviously went through the Boris Johnson years, which was kind of similar to Trump's nonsense, really.
The next thing is Stone Soup's Contains Nuts album from 2004.
Oh, wow. That never came out. Yeah, we made a whole album. That was done with KCB on vocals, Tony Remy on guitar, who I've worked with Us3 and a couple of other projects, and Julian Crampton on bass, who was a bass player who I used in the Us3 band early on. That was in the wake of, what were they called? The sort of Limp Bizkit kind of hip-hop rock kind of thing. And Tony Remy is a phenomenal guitarist. He plays a lot in the UK. He came out of that 90s crop of London-based British jazz musicians. He was initially signed to GRP, and did an album with GRP, which is very kind of fusiony GRP style, kind of, which isn't him really. He did have a band called Desperately Seeking Fusion at one point, which was quite heavy fusion band, but he's a phenomenal Hendrix style soloist. The problem with that album that we did was probably KCB's lyrics, which we'd be murdered if that came out now, because Kay seemed to take the attitude of, why offend one person when you can offend everyone? There's some quite offensive lyrics on that, really, which was funny at the time, but just, I don't think that could ever see the light of day, really.
Next up is Us3's 2001 album, An Ordinary Day in an Unusual Place.
That was the first Us3 album to have a female singer on it, which is Alison Crockett, who I found singing on a King Brit project. And when we actually approached her to do it, actually David Field, the A&R guy, knew someone connected with King Brit, and we were told by his people that she was signed exclusively to him. So we kind of went away and started looking at lots of other different vocalists. Didn't really find anyone that was better than Alison, I thought. So David managed to actually track her down, and when he asked her, she said that's a complete lie. But then she was really into doing it when we managed to speak to her, and she was fantastic. Again, great live. Mick, the rapper, Michelob, the rapper on that, is a bit of an odd one, because he's the only rapper that I ever recorded that we never did a single gig with. And the reason for that was 9/11. His mum worked as a cleaner in one of the buildings and was in the building on the day that it happened, but had left. She normally left by 8 a.m. She'd left. And he lived just across the river, and he saw, I don't think he saw both planes going in, he certainly saw one going in, and he just wouldn't get on a flight after that. He refused to get on a plane. The day that happened, we were actually rehearsing in London. I was rehearsing the band, and Mick and Alison were due to fly from New York to London 2 days after it happened to join the rehearsals, and then we had about a month of gigs in Japan. Obviously, they couldn't fly, and it just all fell apart. It all got cancelled, and actually brought KCB back in to do the gigs then instead of Mick. So we did go about 6 months later. The gigs were rescheduled in Japan. But yeah, from a lyrical point of view, they kind of did reflect that more political, environmental kind of ideas that we talked about a lot. I think they both did a great job. It's a shame that we never managed to do any gigs with Mick, actually, because he was really good.
The next one is Jaguars Out of the Light from 1995.
Wow, okay, now you're going back. That was kind of like a jazzy drum and bass type thing, wasn't it, really? That was done at a time period when I was in conflict with Mel, my original partner in Us3. It took a long time to resolve that conflict. We never had any legal agreement between us. And when I decided that I didn't want to work with him anymore, he didn't want to sell out to me. Yeah, we just became stuck for a while. It took me a long time to persuade him to effectively sell his 50% of the name to me. So the Jaguar album was done while I was in limbo, really. I was probably influenced by the drum and bass DJ called Fabio. His label put out a lot of things like that. There's a track by someone called Adam F called Circles, which was a kind of jazzy drum and bass track. It was influenced by things like that.
The next one is the Wildcat label from 1995 to 1999.
I owned that label. That was the same kind of thing, really. During that downtime period, What's the saying? The devil makes work for idle hands or something like that. I think I just wanted to work then, basically. I'd made some money, obviously, from the first album. So I kind of thought, let's set up my own label.
All right. I wanted to go back to Us3's sophomore album, Broadway and 52nd from 1997.
I think they probably wanted me to. Nobody ever said this to me, but I think they probably wanted me to sample like Watermelon Man or something really obvious for the second album, and I just didn't want to do it. I thought that it would be better to go deeper into the back catalogue with the samples, which is what I did. I'd met KCB before through the work that he'd done with a band called the Jazz Hole, who have recently got back together again and released a new album, actually, which he's gone back into and done some stuff with them. So I already knew Kay. Shabam, I met through Chub Rock. Chub Rock was about to set up a hip-hop label through Capitol Records. But Capitol Records, when we signed, the CEO of Capitol was a guy called Roy Lott. And we only met him once, and he was saying, yeah, it's going to be great. You're going to have a big hit. Everything's going to be fantastic. And then we never met him again because he got sacked, which was a kind of introduction to how the music business works. And the new CEO came in at the top, who was a guy called Gary Gersh, who is best well known for signing Nirvana to Geffen, which gives you an idea of where his head was. He wasn't really that much of an Us3 guy. In fact, he kind of decimated the black music division of Capitol, really. Capitol used to have a lot of soul acts, and he got rid of all those. And Chubb was going to set up a hip-hop label through Capitol, but it didn't happen. When Gersh came in, he stopped it. Bruce Lumval knew this, so Bruce introduced me to Chubb, who lived in New York anyway, and Chubb helped us find rappers. He introduced me to a lot of different rappers. Had countless meetings with him in New York, and Shabam was one guy that he introduced me to who I really liked. That album has the only American jazz musician on that I've recorded, who was Alexander Pope Norris, who plays trumpet on Come On Everybody, who was someone I met through Ed Jones, a sax player. I think he'd been in London. I must have recorded him in London because I only ever recorded in London. So I don't know how Ed had met him, but yeah, he was really good.
Up next is the Raga Twins Rinse and Lyrics album from 1995.
Well, as obviously I'd sort of flirted a bit with a Raga vocalist with Tucker on the first album, on Tucker's Rhythm and 11 Long Years. And I thought that was a really interesting combination, which seemed to work, sort of like jazzy hip-hop with Raga voices on top. I was obviously aware of the Raga Twins because of their drum and bass stuff that they'd done with two guys called PJ and Smiley, who I also knew because, oh wow, this is going back a bit. Before Us3, I'd organised a couple of jazz rap weekends. One was in 1990 at the Jazz Cafe, and one was in 1991 at a club in Kensington, in West Kensington. I can't remember the name now. But PJ and Smiley, who were big guys on the drum and bass circuit, I got them to come and freestyle with what was effectively Steve Williamson's band. And that included a lot of British jazz luminaries like Dennis Rollins on trombone, Tony Remy on guitar, who we were just talking about. And that was long before Us3. It was more about exploring the live side of things, really. There was a guy called Simon Goff, who was the Raga Twins manager, who was doing our promotion for a company called Heavyweight Media. And he put forward the idea. And we had a meeting with them and just got on with them. So they wanted to break out of doing the drum and bass stuff. They said that they wanted to do something more. They were into all kinds of different things, actually, music-wise. And they wanted to do something a bit more musical. They said working with PJ and Smiley was a bit restrictive in that they'd go in and they'd just literally record a couple of lines in half an hour and then get pushed out of the studio. And they just found that when the tracks came out, there was only like a sentence or two sampled that was endlessly repeated, and they wanted to write songs. Basically, they wanted to do verses and choruses, and obviously liked the stuff that we'd done with Tucker. Unfortunately, that album got a bit stuck in mine and Mel's disagreements, and we ended up, I think I did 2 tracks with them separately, and Mel did 2 tracks with them separately in order to finish it. Again, the album, it got signed to Positiva, which was part of EMI, and I don't think they really promoted it. They took the guys to South Africa to make a video, and I think the other video they might have gone to Las Vegas or somewhere ridiculous like that. They spent a lot of money on a video. We put a live band together for them. They played at Ronnie Scott's. They were great. They were really good. And they had a chance to do a Europe-wide tour support with Tony Braxton. That was it. But they obviously needed tour support. It was going to make a loss, and the label wouldn't pay for that. And I think that was the thing that killed it, really, because I remembered back to when Us3 started, the first proper tour that we did in America was as a support act to UB40. We did 6 weeks with them in early 1994. And that really broke us to a lot of people in America. And I think the Raga Twins could have had that if they hadn't blown a lot of money on their videos. So that kind of fizzled out, and they got dropped after the first album.
The last one on the list is NW1's The Band Played the Boogie from 1991.
Yeah, that was really the template for the Blue Note stuff, really. Obviously, it samples Grant Green's version of Suki Suki. That's how the whole thing came about. I knew there was a guy, it was on Ninja Tune, which was a label owned by Matt Black and Jonathan Moore, which is, of course, a hugely successful independent label now. At the time, I think that was about the 9th or 10th release on Ninja Tune, and everything else that had come out before it was Matt and John in different names. So we were the first non-Matt and John project, if you like. But how that actually came about was that Matt and John also released some tracks, kind of breakbeat tracks in the name of DJ Food. And on one of the DJ Food albums, they'd sampled Suki Suki. They had a guy, I used to work in a record store, and I was the assistant manager of a record store called Our Price Records, which was a big chain in London. And the guy who was the manager there was a guy called Duncan James. I'd met Matt before then, this is in the 80s, because Duncan and James had been students together. Matt used to be, when Matt was a kind of fledgling DJ in London, he used to make tapes, he used to sell cassettes, and I'd bought some mixtapes that he'd made of go-go stuff, because that was quite hard to get hold of then. So I knew Matt, but obviously me and Duncan had both left the record store then. Duncan was working as a kind of label manager at Ninja Tune. So I was working as a music journalist then, and he'd sent me this DJ Food album, and I rang him up and said, "This, if you put a rap on this would be really kind of out there, really, you know." I could see the whole jazz and hip hop thing was coming, and me and Mel had already done a 12-inch called Where Will We Be in the 21st Century, which had an English rapper on. And
a jazz keyboardist called Jessica Lauren. And Dunk said to me, "Can we have your rapper?" And I said, "No." So he went away and talked to Matt and John, and they came back and said, "Why don't you do it?" So, yeah, I think the Cold Cut guys were always a bit peeved that ended up in us getting the whole Blue Note back catalogue, really. I still get on with them. I did bump into Matt at a festival a few years ago. He didn't recognise me, which was quite funny because I hadn't seen him for a long, long time, but we had a great chat. But it was that, when the band, obviously Matt and John, as the Cold Cut guys, were DJs on Kiss FM when Kiss FM was a pirate station over here, and then Kiss FM had just got a legal license when that came out, so they got it playlisted on Kiss FM. I used to walk around like Camden Market in London, and you could hear the band played the boogie come banging out of shops and stuff, which was awesome. Then I then got a phone call from the assistant to David Field, the A&R man who eventually signed us, because he'd heard it on the radio, was a bit intrigued. I had a seize of the day moment in the first meeting that I had with him. Literally suggested, if you give us a back catalogue of Blue Note to use as a sampling resource, which I knew was an odd thing to ask for, I said to him we could create the ultimate fusion of hip-hop and jazz. And he didn't agree to it straight away. He went back and spoke to Bruce about it. And even then, they didn't. It was a singles deal at first. And they actually gave us a couple of grand to do some demos. And Cantaloupe was one of the demos that we did. We only did 2 demos. Cantaloupe was one of them, which didn't really change that much from the demo that we did, which was in March 1992. It was a full 2 years before it hit the American top 10. That's a long time. But the other track that we did as a demo didn't even make it onto the album. So we kind of got one right and one completely wrong.
How would you contrast the music industry Us3 entered with its first album compared to the version you're releasing soundtracks into now?
Wow, it's completely different now. This has been a real learning curve for me, actually, putting this out now. I just wanted to put the album out as it is. It's an album. It's not an album of singles. But then I was told that's not the way you do it now. You need to drip feed 4 singles 5 weeks apart. You need to trip the algorithm. It's just different. It's a completely different landscape. Even to when I last put out The Third Way in 2013, streaming didn't exist then. It's just completely different. It's baffling to me why the music industry would allow itself to be taken over by a couple of digital companies the way that it happened. First of all, with Apple, with iTunes, and then with Spotify. When I worked in a record shop in the early 80s, most of the big labels distributed their own stuff directly to the stores. But now they're just not in control. It's hard to think of another industry that would allow that to happen. I don't know why, when the digital thing started coming in, I think the major labels should have set up their own digital distribution stores, if you like. So say if you wanted to buy an Us3 album, then you would go to us3.com to buy it digitally, but you would actually be buying it. The back end would be coming from Capitol Records digital distribution thing. That was a big mistake. They just didn't invest the way they should have. I think when someone writes a history of the music business, maybe in like 50 or 100 years or something, they will see that when multinational corporations got involved with it was when it all got fucked up. Labels like Blue Note and Atlantic or whatever were just so much more creative and so much more interesting when they were independent labels in the 60s. When they started getting taken over by bigger labels, That's when it all started to go wrong to me. My publishing came up for renewal a couple of years ago, and it was originally with EMI Music in New York, who were bought out by Sony. So when it came up, the first chance I got to get away from Sony, I did, and signed up with Downtown, who are a big independent publisher. And now Downtown are being bought out by Universal. So it's just an absolute nightmare, the way the big labels and big publishers just gobble up the successful small ones. It's ongoing. I think it's wrong. I don't think it should be allowed to happen.
On a more positive note, what can you tell me about how you go about channeling inspiration into concrete musical ideas?
I honestly don't know what drives me to do it. I don't know. When I come up with ideas to do things like that, I always look around and kind of have a look and think, this must have been done by someone else before. I can't be the only person on the planet that's thought of this. And then you have a look around and you think, maybe I am. So I'll have to do something about it. Music is practically my whole damn life, really. So I do have some more stuff in the can, which is an obvious step further than what I've done. It needs vocals on it. It'd be for next year. I hope I get to put this out. It's different again. It's more commercial, but it's different again.
And how would you describe your ambitions for this album? What do you hope it achieves out there in the world?
Well, I called it soundtrack because it feels like a soundtrack in search of a movie to me. So I would love for some of it, all of it, to be synced to a movie. I would be really, really happy if that happened. I think this will be seen as a bit of an aberration as an album. You know, when I initially signed, the A&R guy that signed me, David Field, I said to him right from the beginning that I thought that it might be limiting just sampling Blue Note stuff all along. And we talked about David Bowie's output from the 70s and how stylistically he changed with album to album, sometimes relatively small shifts, sometimes huge shifts, and stayed on the same label. The label stayed with him. And I said to David, I just don't think that would happen now. I mean, that was back in the 90s. And he said to me, I'll always back you up, whatever you want to do. If you want to make a salsa album next, I'll back you up. But then he left after the first album. So again, that was a bit of a rude awakening to the music business, because I think people kind of promise you things that even they must be aware that they can't really deliver. But the way I look at this album, it's a bit like my low period, if you compare it with Bowie, where he just did something odd, left field and instrumental.
If you could talk directly to Us3 fans that have a history with the vocal work and the big hits, what would you say to them about what they should keep in mind when listening to Soundtrack?
It's a 21st century version of the fusion of jazz and hip-hop. I brought it kicking and screaming up to date, I think. So yeah, just keep an open mind. I'm sure the people who liked Hand on the Torch, most of them probably don't do the same job that they did 30 years ago. Most of them probably don't like the same things that they did 30 years ago. Everything changes, and this is a logical change, I think. It's a logical progression to me. So I hope that the audience feels that way as well.